Hello, and welcome to FTA's Circular 9050 Urbanized Area Formula Grant Programs Training Series. I am Brett Martin with the Office of Grants Management and Guidance. FTA's Offices of Transit Programs and Grants Management and Guidance designed this series to provide our recipients and stakeholders a better understanding of changes made to FTA's official guidance for recipients' use of Section 5307, 5337, and 5339A formula funds apportioned to urbanized areas. To ensure we are all on the same page, I want to remind everyone that this presentation does not have the force and effect of the law and is not intended to bind the public in any way. It is educational and informational in nature with an intent to explain some of our existing requirements under the law or agency policy. Now I would like to introduce Bruce Robinson, our Associate Administrator of Program Management, to provide our welcoming remarks.
Hello, my name is Bruce Robinson, FTA's Associate Administrator for Program Management. On behalf of the team here at the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, I'm delighted to provide a brief introduction to the upcoming video training. FTA turned 60 years old this year, and one of our most exciting projects this year was updating several of FTA's major program circulars, as well as FTA's Award Management Requirement Circular, which is needed for all awards FTA administers. Over the last 2 years, staff worked tirelessly to update these circulars, working with headquarters and regional offices, as well as reaching out for public comment to update these documents. 4 circulars are Circular 5010, the Award Management Requirements Circular, Circular 9050, the Urbanized Area Formula Grant Program Guidance. This circular replaces, consolidates, and updates guidance for the Urbanized Area Formula Grant Program, the State of Good Repair Grant Program, and the Urbanized Area Formula component of the Grants of Buses and Bus Facilities Program. In addition, Circular 9040, the Rural Area Formula Grant Program Guidance, consolidates and updates guidance for the Buses and Bus Facilities Program, that is rural, and the Formula Grants for Rural Area Program. Finally, Circular 97 is the Enhanced Mobility of Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities Program Guidance. As part of the updated circular release, FTA developed a video series for each circular to relay key information and highlight changes. Additionally, the team developed a number of materials to help work with grantees and help set the stage for understanding federal financial assistance requirements surrounding administering federal fund awards. This circular and training series is specifically designed to assist FTA's efforts to improving customer service and streamlining our processes, as well as reflecting and incorporating provisions from the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or more commonly the FAST Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as changes to the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, more commonly referred to as 2 CFR 200 or the Uniform Guidance, as well as incorporating changes to FTA's policies and procedures. We hope you find these videos informative. FTA has created a general email address for questions related to this update, FTA Circular Update 2024 at dot.gov, to assist in addressing questions regarding this release. For questions about information in the circulars, please reach out to your FTA regional contacts. But for now, please enjoy the show. Thank you.
Each Friday from October 18 through November 15, 2024, FTA is posting a series of pre-recorded videos addressing summary grants management information and highlighting changes made in each of the updated circulars, including our Award Management Requirements Circular and each of our Formula Program circulars. The Circular 9050, Urbanized Areas Formula Grant Programs training, builds upon the foundation we established in the previous training series for Circular 5010, our Award Management Requirements Circular. This series was developed to highlight many of the structural and substantive changes made to the circular to help users navigate and better understand the circular as a guidance tool. The illustration on the slide outlines the general topics for the sessions in this series. The route ahead is our agenda. For Session 2, we will walk through eligible funding recipients, metropolitan planning requirements and program of projects development, transit asset management requirements, public transportation safety requirements, fares charged to seniors and individuals with disabilities, and pre-award authority. Our speakers for this session are myself from the Office of Guidance and Grants Management, and Kirsten Wired-Bauer and Ciara Williams from our Office of Transit Programs. And our first speaker will be Kirsten.
Thank you, Brett. So we will kick this session off with an overview of FTA's formula distribution structure for Section 5307, 5337, and 5339A funds. And this is covered in more detail in Chapter 2 of the circular. We'll start off with who receives and has control over the formula funding that FTA distributes for each type of census designation. So for rural areas and small UZAs, funds are provided to states and territories, and they determine how the funds will be used and the recipients to whom the funds will be further distributed. So state and territorial governments have control over this funding. For large UZAs, funds are provided to a locally selected designated recipient. That designated recipient determines how the funds will be used and to which other recipients they will be further distributed. So for large UZAs, designated recipients have control of the funding. This graphic illustrates the distribution structure of funds for large UZAs. FTA makes funds available to designated recipients. At the designated recipient's discretion, funds may be further allocated to either direct recipients or subrecipients of the designated recipient, or funds may pass through a direct recipient to go to one of their subrecipients. In order for an entity to be a direct recipient of FTA formula funds, that entity must be authorized by the designated recipient to receive grants directly from FTA. This slide lays out the formula funding distribution structure for small UZAs. This structure is very similar to the structure for large UZAs that we just discussed, except that states serve the same function that a designated recipient does in a large UZA. So FTA makes funds available to states, which are then further allocated to direct recipients and subrecipients. In this next section, I'll talk about how designated recipients in large UZAs are selected. For large UZAs, designated recipients must be selected and appointed to receive and distribute funds, whereas for small UZAs, this step is not needed as states automatically serve that role. Circular 9050 provides direction on how a designated recipient is selected. FTA encourages the selection of a single designated recipient for each large UZA and for all types of formula funds in order to streamline administration of the programs. However, FTA does not preclude the selection of more than one designated recipient for the same formula program in a UZA or separate designated recipients for each of the formula programs. Designated recipients are ultimately appointed by the governor or governor's designee of the state where the large UZA is located. If the large UZA extends into more than one state, then there must be an agreement on the designated recipient from each state's governor or governor's designee. States' governors or their designees must show that all of the publicly owned operators of public transportation in the UZA, as well as the applicable Metropolitan Planning Organization, all concur on the selection of an entity as the designated recipient before appointing them. It is also important to point out that for the 5339A program specifically, designated recipients must either operate fixed route bus service or allocate funds to fixed route bus operators. So with the designation process being established, let's move on to the roles and responsibilities of designated recipients in program administration. To start, designated recipients in states are responsible for receiving and apportioning funds to both eligible recipients and eligible projects in the applicable UZA. This is communicated through what is known as a split letter for a large UZA and an apportionment letter for a small UZA. Designated recipients are also responsible for developing a program of projects with Section 5307 and 5339A funds. The program of projects should include the suballocation of funds to direct recipients or subrecipients and descriptions and costs of the projects or activities that each entity is proposing to carry out. Additionally, states and designated recipients are responsible for ensuring that the program of projects meets statutory program requirements. They're also responsible for coordinating with the Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, to ensure that the projects in the program of projects are derived from the Metropolitan planning process and are included in MPO planning and project programming documents, such as the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Transportation Improvement Program. It is essential to stress that the suballocation of funds to recipients and projects is a local decision based on regional priorities in coordination with the MPO. One big change in the roles of states and designated recipients that the new circular reflects is the expanded eligibility of Section 5339A direct recipients. Prior to the FAST Act, or pre-FY 2016, only states and designated recipients could be direct recipients of Section 5339A funds, meaning only they could apply for funds and enter into grant agreements with FTA for the use of those funds. Any other recipients of those funds had to be set up as subrecipients. Since the FAST Act, designated recipients and states have been able to suballocate funds to other direct recipients for them to make their own grants and enter into grant agreements with FTA for the use of those funds. Another update that the new circular reflects is changes to Section 5307 program level expenditure requirements. We'll review 3 program level expenditure requirements here. First, associated transit improvements. Associated transit improvements are projects that are designed to enhance public transportation service or use that are physically or functionally related to transit facilities. Prior to the FAST Act, designated recipients were required to allocate a minimum of 1% of a large UZA's Section 5307 apportionment to associated transit improvements. Since the FAST Act, this minimum expenditure requirement no longer applies, but recipients may continue to expend their funds on the same types of improvements. For public transportation security projects, the requirement for recipients to expend a minimum of 1% of their Section 5307 funds on security projects, unless they decide and certify they are unnecessary, remains the same. This was carried forward to the new Circular 9050. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law created a new public transportation safety project requirement. Recipients must expend a minimum of 0.75% of their Section 5307 funds on safety-related projects, and designated recipients need to ensure this is applied to each recipient. Brett will cover this new requirement in more detail later in this session. Okay, so let's move on and talk about direct recipients, and contractors. First, a direct recipient is a public entity authorized by a state or designated recipient to apply for and receive funds directly from FTA. In order for recipients to receive funds directly, they must enter into a grant agreement with FTA. That agreement requires that entity to comply with a number of provisions and parameters, as set by legislation authorizing the funds and their use, as well as federal administrative regulations and agency policy. This also subjects that entity to FTA oversight and performance monitoring requirements, including reporting requirements and compliance reviews. An example is FTA's triennial review process, which reviews recipient compliance every 3 years. As previously mentioned, a state designated recipient or another direct recipient may pass funds through to another entity and assume all responsibility under a grant agreement with FTA for a subrecipient's use of those funds. FTA requires the pass-through entity that is taking on this responsibility and the subrecipient entity to enter into a subrecipient agreement that assures FTA that the subrecipient will comply with its obligation to satisfy the requirements of any associated grant agreements. Subrecipients must be a public entity otherwise eligible to be a direct recipient for each of the urbanized area formula programs, with some exceptions. Private nonprofit operators of public transportation may be subrecipients of Section 5339A funds, and they may also be subrecipients of Section 5307 funds for the purposes of carrying out eligible job access and reverse commute projects. One major addition of guidance to Chapter 2 of Circular 9050 concerns private operators of public transportation as contractors. Private for-profit operators of public transportation are not eligible as direct recipients or subrecipients of Section 5307, 5337, or 5339A funds. However, eligible direct recipients may enter into a contracted service arrangement with these private operators to provide public transportation services. These operators may be private taxi companies, transportation network companies, or other types of operators. If direct recipients contract with these types of operators with FTA funds, they must ensure that they will provide shared ride service as opposed to exclusive ride service. And their services must be open to the general public or a segment of the general public defined by age, disability, or low income. Additionally, the services that they provide must comply with the same federal requirements for federal transportation service as if the recipient is providing the service itself, such as Americans with Disabilities Act accommodations. And to provide a little more guidance here on shared ride versus exclusive ride service, shared ride service must be open to accommodating 2 or more passengers who are not otherwise traveling together in a vehicle at the same time on a regular basis during any period of funded service. There doesn't always have to be at least 2 such funded passengers in a vehicle contracted for service, but it must be open to at least 2 passengers while it is operating. At no time during a period of funded service may a vehicle be reserved for the exclusive use by individuals or private groups, and the service may not be set up to require consent from passengers to accommodate additional passengers. All right, so that wraps up our coverage on eligible funding recipients for the Urbanized Area Formula programs covered by Circular 9050. I am now going to turn it back over to Brett to talk about Metropolitan planning requirements and program of projects development.
Thank you, Kirsten. Now that we've established how funds are made available and who can receive and use those funds, we're going to skip ahead to Chapter 5 of the new Circular 9050 and cover our Metropolitan planning and program of project development processes and requirements, which establishes the framework for states, designated recipients, and other recipients to identify their needs and priorities for how to use the Urbanized Area Formula funds. The metropolitan and statewide planning process and associated requirements really need to be carried out and run their course well in advance of submission of a grant application for a project or activity. Metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, are responsible for leading these processes. For recipients to access Section 5307, 5337, and 5339A funds, capital and operating projects and activities to be assisted by these funds must be a product of these processes as reflected in the applicable MPO's federally required Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Transportation Improvement Program, the MTP and TIP, and in the applicable state's statewide Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. Any FTA-assisted planning projects must be included in the MPO's Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP. The conception and prioritization of projects to be assisted by FTA should be driven by a performance-based approach, and project selection and formula funding allocations to recipients should be determined by the state or by a designated recipient in cooperation with the MPO as applicable. To ensure the participation of transit providers in the process, MPOs for large urbanized areas must include representation from providers of public transportation on the MPO's governing body. All right, so now that we've generally covered the planning framework within which transportation investment decisions need to be made, we'll move on and talk a bit about the roles of states and designated recipients in relation to the MPO for carrying out this process, which is really best explained by covering the relationship between programs of projects to be funded by Urbanized Area Formula funds and metropolitan planning products. For Section 5307 and 5339A funds that are apportioned to an urbanized area, a program of projects must be developed by the designated recipient for large urbanized areas and the state for small urbanized areas, in cooperation with other recipients in the applicable urbanized areas in accordance with the outcomes of the metropolitan planning process. I will go ahead and mention that a program of projects is not required for Section 5337 apportionments. However, designated recipients and states may choose to subject those funds to the same process, and the metropolitan planning process and associated requirements are still applicable to those funds. The program of projects serves a few purposes. First, it serves as the designated recipients or state's proposal for the projects and recipients to which and to whom the funds will be allocated. Second, it is the designated recipients or state's demonstration of compliance with program requirements, such as the minimum expenditure requirements Kirsten covered just a bit earlier, but a number of different types of program requirements could come into play. And third, it is intended to communicate the designated recipient's proposal for projects to the public for its input before a final decision on the projects that will be carried out is made. The program of projects for Section 5307 and 5339A apportionments is subject to public participation requirements outlined in Title 49, Section 5307 of the United States Code. The Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, is developed and approved by the MPO in cooperation with the designated recipient or state with the active participation of other recipients in the applicable urbanized area. The program of projects developed by the designated recipient or state must be included in the TIP and, as mentioned, must be derived from or consistent with the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. And the TIP also has public participation requirements, and FTA has determined that these public participation requirements may be used to satisfy those for the program of projects. The Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, is developed and approved by the state in cooperation with MPOs because it must incorporate the TIPs that are developed and improved by the MPOs. However, it is important to note here that for small urbanized areas, TIPs may take the place of the program of projects once they are adopted by the state into the STIP. And the graphic on this slide is really just trying to lay out the relationship between the development of the program of projects and the steps taken to carry out the metropolitan planning process from a sequential perspective. It starts with the identification of priorities and needs for public transportation investment in the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. From that, the designated recipient or state produced the program of projects and works with the MPO to include them in the TIP, and then the MPO works with the state to include them in the STIP. So with this framework being established for how projects are determined to be financed with the urbanized area formula funds, one thing Circular 9050 has clarified is the relationship between post-award modifications and reconciling them with the planning process. If the outcome of an award modification will deviate from the previously adopted program of projects, TIP or STIP, the recipient needs to submit documentation that those planning projects have been amended or updated to reflect the respective change before the award modification is executed. Such modifications that may require these steps may include changes to the scope of a project, the amount of federal assistance allocated to it, the period of performance for the project, and potentially others. Another clarification made in Circular 9050 concerns the geography of metropolitan planning requirements. The key here is that the metropolitan planning jurisdiction of MPOs includes an area bound by what is called a metropolitan planning area, which is required to include the entirety of the urbanized area it serves, as well as contiguous surrounding area that is anticipated to become urbanized in 20 years. So the planning jurisdiction of the MPO typically extends beyond the boundaries of just the urbanized area. And any projects that fall within the metropolitan planning area, which may extend beyond the boundaries of the urbanized area, must be included in the MPO's TIP and be consistent with the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. The source of FTA funding, whether it is urbanized area funds or rural funds, does not determine whether projects must be included in an MPO's TIP. So for example, a fixed location capital project funded with urbanized area apportioned funds that is located within the urbanized area must be included in the TIP. Also, a fixed location capital project funded with rural funds, such as 5311, that is located outside the urbanized area but within the metropolitan planning area, must be included in the TIP. A fixed location capital project that is not within the metropolitan planning area does not need to be included in the TIP, but still must be included in the STIP. Some other program of projects changes or clarifications made in Circular 9050 concern substitute projects in the grant application and the reporting of associated transit improvements. Our clarified guidance on substitute projects states that only recipients with more than one subrecipient may include such projects in a grant application. Under such circumstances, the cost of the projects should not initially be included in the grant budget, but recipients must still demonstrate that they have met the same requirements as any other project that is included in the grant budget. This allows for substitute projects to be funded in a grant should a previously funded project be postponed or dropped from moving forward. For associated transit improvements, Chapter 53 of Title 49 requires recipients operating in large urbanized areas to submit an annual report to FTA listing Section 5307 funded projects or elements thereof that have funded associated transit improvements in the previous fiscal year. The guidance now lays out that FTA does not require a separate report for recipients to complete for these improvements because they are automatically captured in TRAMs in applicable awards. All right, so that finishes up our coverage on the metropolitan planning process and program of projects development and any related changes reflected in Circular 9050. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ciara Williams, who is our Section 5337 State of Good Repair Grants Program Manager, to cover the addition of guidance on transit asset management requirements in Circular 9050.
Thank you, Brett. I'm Ciara Williams with the Office of Transit Programs, and I'm going to briefly cover the addition of guidance on transit asset management requirements in Circular 9050. The intent of FTA's transit asset management responsibilities is to assist the nation's transit systems in assessing their capital needs and prioritizing capital investments to achieve a state of good repair. State of good repair is the condition in which a capital asset is able to operate at a full level of performance. The provisions that lay out transit asset management responsibilities for recipients are provided at 49 U.S.C. 5326, and these provisions are applicable to all FTA recipients. Within these provisions, it is a requirement for each FTA recipient and subrecipient to develop a transit asset management plan or participate in a group plan that includes an asset inventory with condition assessments that are reported to FTA, as well as an investment prioritization. Each recipient must also annually set and report to FTA performance targets based on performance measures developed from State of Good Repair standards that are detailed at 49 CFR 625.41. The level of transit asset management plan requirements that apply to recipients is broken into two tiers that generally scale with recipient size or modal focus. Transit providers that fall into Tier 1 must develop and carry out their own plan that includes each element listed under 49 CFR 625.25b. Tier 1 applies to all recipients that operate rail public transportation service, that operate more than 100 vehicles across all fixed route modes, or that operate more than 100 vehicles in one non-fixed route mode. Transit providers that fall into Tier 2, which are those that do not meet the threshold established for recipients for Tier 1, may develop and carry out their own plan, or they may participate in a group plan. Plans developed and carried out under Tier 2 must include each element listed under 49 CFR 625.25b 1 through 4. With this, I'd like to highlight the importance of transit asset management planning to recipients' use of Section 5337 funds. All Section 5337 funded projects must be included in a recipient's TAM plan and recipients are required to certify that they have implemented their TAM plan according to FTA's final implementing rule at 49 CFR Part 625. Section 5307 and 5339A funded projects may also be included in a TAM, but it is not required. So now I'll turn it back over to Brett to discuss our next topic.
Thanks, Ciara. So now we are going to talk about another set of program level requirements for which there is a lot more emphasis in Circular 9050 as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is our public transportation safety requirements. So we will start this with our public transportation safety plan requirements, which apply to Section 5307 recipients and rail transit agencies. This slide breaks down the requirements of public transportation agency safety plans by Section 5307 recipients in small urbanized areas versus those in large urbanized areas. For all Section 5307 recipients, public transportation safety plans need to include processes and activities related to safety management system implementation, a process and timeline for conducting an annual review and update of the plan, and the assignment of an adequately trained safety officer who reports directly to the general manager, president, or equivalent officer of the organization. For recipients in small urbanized areas, plans need to include a requirement that the plan and subsequent updates are developed in cooperation with frontline transit worker representatives. And in large urbanized areas, they need to include a risk reduction program for transit operations to improve safety performance by reducing the number and rates of safety events, injuries, and assaults on transit workers. Plans for small and large urbanized areas recipients also need to include safety performance targets based on the safety performance measures established in the National Safety Plan, a comprehensive safety training program for operations transit workers and those directly responsible for safety that includes de-escalation training and safety concern identification and reporting training, and that any updates to the plan are signed by an accountable executive and approved by the governing body. However, for large urbanized areas, the targets must be set by a joint labor management safety committee. The training program must include maintenance personnel, and the plans and any updates thereto must be approved by the safety committee before the governing body. There are additional agency safety planning requirements for rail transit agencies above and beyond those I just mentioned, which include an emergency preparedness and response plan and procedures, any policies and procedures regarding rail transit workers on the roadway the rail transit agency has issued, and agency policies and procedures developed in consultation with the State Safety Oversight Agency to provide access and required data for that agency's risk-based inspection program. More information on these requirements and to whom they apply is available on FTA's Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan webpage, for which a link has been provided on the slide. All right, so let's dig a bit deeper into the requirement for Section 5307 recipients in large urbanized areas to expend a minimum of 0.75% of their Section 5307 funds on safety-related projects. This requirement applies to all funds authorized under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law enacted November 15, 2021, and any prior year unobligated funds. So this means it applies to any unobligated funds that were apportioned in prior federal transportation funding authorizations, such as the FAST Act. This requirement applies to each recipient receiving large urbanized area Section 5307 funds for each fiscal year of apportionment, and there is no exemption to this requirement via certification that it is unnecessary, like there is for the minimum 1% requirement for security expenses. However, the minimum expenditure does not have to be applied to each individual grant made with Section 5307 funds. This is a change in how our guidance has directed operationalization prior to the applicable date of the circular. Because it must be applied to each recipient, it cannot merely be satisfied as a total expenditure for an urbanized area as a whole, such that some recipients are carrying the load for satisfying the requirement, while others are not. It is also important to stress that safety is viewed as a goal and not a specific type of project or expense. There are a wide variety of expenses that could be identified as safety related if a case can be made by the recipient, and these expenses could be integral to activities recipients otherwise already propose to carry out. And some additional points I'd like to make on this are that recipients serving more than one large urbanized area are encouraged to spend this minimum amount in each urbanized area, but they are not required to do that. However, if they receive separate apportionments for 2 or more large urbanized areas, they still need to spend a minimum of 0.75% from their share of each apportionment. Also, the requirement does not need to apply to individual subrecipients. Recipients with multiple subrecipients may satisfy the requirement as a collective whole. The requirement may be satisfied as a capital or planning activity, or through operating assistance if the recipient is otherwise eligible to receive operating assistance. And some safety expenditures may be used to also satisfy the 1% minimum expenditure requirement for safety-related projects and vice versa. All right, so another very important point for this is there is a relationship between this expenditure requirement and recipients' performance against their risk reduction targets. If recipients do not meet their established risk reduction targets, the minimum safety expenditure for the following fiscal year must be allocated to projects that are reasonably likely to assist the recipient in meeting their targets. However, if recipients do meet their targets, this does not mean that they are exempt from the minimum expenditure requirement altogether. They still must expend a minimum of 0.75% on safety-related projects, but have more discretion on the projects those funds will assist. Okay, and one last point I'd like to make on this topic is that we do have some exemptions from the Public Transportation Agency safety planning requirements altogether. 49 CFR 673.11F exempts agencies that operate passenger ferries regulated by the Coast Guard and rail fixed guideway service regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration from the agency safety planning requirements for those modes. So this means that agencies that only operate those modes are not required to have a public transportation agency safety plan, and they are exempt from the 0.75% safety set aside in large urbanized areas. However, with that being established, for agencies that operate those modes in addition to other modes that are not exempt, the Public Transportation Agency safety planning requirements still apply to those other modes, and the safety set-aside is still applicable. All right, so we will move on to our next topic under this umbrella of planning and program level requirements, and we will talk about clarifications made by Circular 9050 on the half-fare requirement for recipients of Section 5307 funds. This requirement related to fares is if a recipient provides transportation service that uses or involves a facility or equipment financed under Section 5307 or 5339A, they may not charge seniors, individuals with disabilities, or individuals presenting a Medicare card more than 50% of the peak hour fare during non-peak hours. This requirement applies only to fixed route services that operate during both peak and off-peak hours. For all fixed route services, if the operator has not defined peak hours, and to fixed route services that operate with reduced fares during both peak and non-peak periods. It does not apply to demand response services, services that operate only during peak hours or only during non-peak periods, or services that do not use Section 5307 or 5339A funded equipment or are not operated out of Section 5307 or 5339A funded facilities. And to dig into this even deeper, some recipients' systems may not be large enough or demand may not be strong enough to define peak hours. In this case, if no peak hours are defined, all operational time is non-peak, and no more than half the fare may be charged during all operational times. In terms of its applicability to fare structures, the half-fare option must be offered on the single trip base fare when paid in cash or using media that pay the fare of the single trip, such as through smart cards or phone apps. Recipients are not required to offer half-fare versions of multi-trip passes and other multi-trip fare media. All right, so now I'm going to take us through some important points we would like to make regarding pre-award authority and then close out this session. Pre-award authority allows recipients to incur certain project costs before an award is approved to subsidize the project and retain reimbursement or credit eligibility after award approval. In order to pull off this arrangement, recipients are responsible for compliance with any conditions that would otherwise apply to the project, as well as the risk, and recipients' actions may not prejudice the ability for FTA to participate in the project. Information was added in the circular to clarify announcement and notification mechanisms that communicate FTA's policy for pre-award authority, as well as what triggers the ability to undertake projects in advance of awards for certain types of expenses. The circular speaks to announcements and/or notifications for automatic pre-award authority, which is a sort of blanket or umbrella authority to incur costs for a range of many types of projects or activities under certain conditions, and later claim those costs for reimbursement or credit under an award. Automatic pre-award authority for formula programs is outlined annually in FTA's annual apportionment notice. Automatic pre-award authority with any corresponding conditions for projects to be supported by discretionary program funds, if granted, is announced in the applicable notice of funding opportunity or when projects are selected. If activities or programs are not covered by automatic pre-award authority through these announcement mechanisms, it must be approved on a project-specific and case-by-case basis through a letter of no prejudice. All right, so let's talk a bit more about pre-award authority for our urbanized area formula programs. As mentioned, the notification mechanism for automatic pre-award authority is FTA's annual apportionment notice published in the Federal Register, and the extent to which costs may be incurred in advance of an award is heavily dependent on the type of activity a recipient is proposing to carry out that would be covered under that award to be executed later. For operating assistance and planning activities, pre-award costs may be incurred irrespective of the period of time covered by a federal funding authorization. For capital projects that meet the criteria for a C-list categorical exclusion, NEPA class of action, pre-award costs may be incurred through the full period of a federal funding authorization. And for capital projects that require a higher level environmental review or NEPA class of action than a C-list categorical exclusion, costs may be incurred through the full period of a federal funding authorization if and when the environmental review or NEPA process is completed. A letter of no prejudice is a mechanism to allow and approve pre-award authority for capital projects or activities to use funding allocations that are not covered by automatic pre-award authority. For example, it may be for expenses to be accrued beyond the period of a current federal funding authorization. This mechanism for authorizing pre-award authority is provided by FTA on a project-specific and case-by-case basis when requested and if approved, and the extent to which it authorizes the use of future funding allocated that extend beyond a current federal funding authorization will be specified in the letter of no prejudice. Similarly here, regardless of the project, the same environmental review conditions apply. This concludes our formal presentation of Session 2 of the 3 sessions for our Circular 9050.1a training series. While this slide is entitled Next Steps, the ball is really in your court to decide what you would like to do next. As noted, we are continuing our series of videos that will be posted to FTA's website through mid-November 2024. Those videos are posted where you found this one. The email address goes right to our office, and we will follow up to address those questions and concerns. Also included are links to the finalized circulars. As part of our ongoing efforts and commitment to serving the public, FTA is committed to improving America's communities through improving public transportation. We share a vision of fostering a better quality of life for all, built on public transportation excellence through commitment to service, integrity, innovation, sustainability, and equity. And thank you again for watching, and we hope you will view our other videos related to the updated circulars.